Welcome back. Today we're going to be taking another look at Joe Mad and continue our learning journey. But this time we're going to be looking at his awesome rendering in Inhuman. We're going to be studying everything from how he renders muscles, how he renders faces in different types of lighting situations, how he uses silhouettes to his advantage, how he renders folds in clothing, and we'll be learning some of the background effects that he uses to influence our emotions as the viewer. Grab your sketchbook and let's have a truly deep dive. Muscles. In this section we're going to be covering how Joe renders different muscle groups. We're not going to be tackling clothing just yet, as this will be in this timestamp if you want to skip ahead. Let's look at lash, as this is a great example for us to learn from. In terms of the lighting, you might assume there is just one light in the scene, behind lash. However, if we look closely, we can see that Joe added a very subtle bounce light just in front of lash. If there was just the main light, then the areas such as Lash's left cheekbone, his left pectoral, and his abs wouldn't have these wonderful little highlights. Adding in this bounce light gives us more of a view of just how strong and muscular Lash actually is. If this bounce light didn't exist and it was a completely black area, then he would look a lot more mysterious and a lot less physically brutish. There is no right or wrong here. It's all about what you want to do and what you want to tell the viewer. I just want to point out a very cool little detail in his line work before we delve into his cross-hatching. If we look at Lash's right tricep area, he has added in lots of little eraser marks in the direction of the light, which I think is super cool. It's almost as if the light is so powerful, it's erasing his actual line work. Now, let's have a deep dive into his cross-hatching, and he uses two different techniques in the same panel, which I think is super interesting. For example, if we look at Lash's right arm area, some of these cross-hatching groups follow the light direction, instead of the contour of the muscles. The same can be seen on his obliques, whereas just to the side of his abs, the hatching is following the contour of the muscle instead. Normally, artists will stick to one technique. I've not seen anyone mix and match so subtly before. I think the decision making regarding this is, if the muscle area is very close to the light source, he will switch the rendering toward the light to avoid any of that pesky render repetition. As for the hatch marks themselves, if I was to compare them to some of my favourite artists such as Mark Silvestri or Jim Lee, Joe's are quantifiably contained. The stroke sizes themselves are all pretty small, and there are rarely any that go beyond the general average length. The shape of these groupings tends to be with a curve, or with a slope leading to a peak stroke. One interesting decision that Joe throws in there from time to time is that he uses tiny amounts of parallel cross-hatching, whereby he fills the whole area with parallel lines. I just want to take 10 seconds just to thank the people that have already signed up to my YouTube members. It really warms my heart that you want to support me in this way and help me continue making some more videos. So, mushiness over, thank you very much. Faces. In this section we're going to be covering many different types of lighting and how he uses different lighting setups for different faces in different situations. We won't be covering too much of the line work of the faces themselves, as we've already covered that in a previous video. Common lighting. Joe's lighting on faces typically falls into three different categories. Category number 1 is minimal lighting and therefore minimal cross-hatching and rendering. Number 2 is where it's a harsh light, but certain aspects of the face will pop out. And number 3 is where the lighting is so harsh that the face is just completely covered in shadow. So, let's take a deep dive into each of these. Minimal lighting. Joe doesn't take these as a hard and fast rule. He may use them 3 times out of 5 or 1 time out of 5, but he always mixes and matches these ideas. So, I suggest we do too. One of these aspects where everybody gets the same treatment, no matter the gender or size or build, is lips. Joe loves to add in these little tiny shadows underneath the lips. With women and children, he typically adds less cross-hatching out of this core shadow, whereas males tend to have more multi-directional cross-hatching. The next step up in terms of our minimal rendering is adding cast shadows from noses. This particularly happens when characters are feeling powerful and mighty. If we look closely, we can see that he takes into consideration the formation of the face and how that warps and changes the shape of the shadow, which is super interesting. Harsh lighting. When the tea is spilled and the drama is royally hitting the fan, Joe will turn up the brightness of those lights and add some very dramatic lighting. Quite often, he will choose to let certain parts of the face poke out from the shadow, such as eyes and noses. With these examples here, we can see Joe implements similar lighting for each of these individual panels. We can see that he doesn't render the nose or sometimes just a part of it. I think he does this to give shape and a landmark to us as the viewer to an otherwise very black area. There is also no rendering to the eyes, but the eye socket area is rendered, which I think makes the eyes and whatever expression they're showing stand out amongst that deep sea of black. What I find interesting is that he gives extra definition to jaws, cheekbones, and that tense area in between by adding sharp, angular shadow shapes. I quite like the way that he lets the chin poke out into the light too, because if this face were 3D, that would be on a similar level and plane, together with the nose. As for the cross-hatching on faces, I have a small sample size, so let's get to it. In general, Joe will render in the direction of the contour shape. If we look at this example, we can see on Dante's forehead, the core shadow has cross-hatching at parallel 45-degree angles. Imagine if this face were a 3D model, or the contour lines of the head were drawn on. These cross-hatching marks would follow that flow. On very few occasions, Joe will render towards the light source, which isn't wrong, it's just a stylistic choice. At this point, you might be thinking, Pancake, you haven't mentioned female characters once. What gives? Well, women don't tend to have heavy rendering in Joe's world, or at least those situations with cross-hatching. He will use large areas of heavy shadows with just one aspect of their design or character poking through. For Gabriella, it's her glasses, and for Medusa, it's her domineering eyes. For me, this shows so much skill for storytelling and putting that first over rendering and technique. Which brings me to my next point. Silhouettes. Joe uses silhouettes a lot. For example, in issue 2, there are 21 pages and 8 different pages with a silhouette. That's a lot of silhouettes. And that's not including the panels where Gabriella or Medusa are just slightly silhouetted. But reading Inhuman, you probably wouldn't pick up on it because he's so good at it and he uses it so timely. So, let's get into it. Joe quite often uses silhouette panels as a very cool framing device. One aspect of this is that he uses it to show an imbalance of characters, be it their physical size, their power, or both at the same time. In these two panels, we can see that size is emphasized between the characters, making the smaller character feel much smaller and much more alone. If they weren't silhouettes and fully detailed drawings instead, that size difference wouldn't be as immediately apparent. We'd be looking at expressions and details instead of their overall shapes. In these panels, I think the silhouette provides an extra context of power. In each of them, Medusa is in a physically and royally higher position and therefore takes up a lot more panel space than the other character. One other way he uses them as a framing device is to give space to a central figure or figures. In these panels, we can see that the subject of the panel is in front and centre, and an easy way to emphasise what is important by using silhouettes as a layering device. Or by using a triangle composition around them. Clothing. Just like we learned in our previous video about hair, when clothing gets dark, it gets complicated. But let's break it down. Clothing is split into two teams in Joe's world. Lighter colours have nearly no rendering, and darker clothes have heavy spot blacks to indicate folds. On lighter clothing and fabrics, he keeps the folds very simple. Instead of using swooping W and M shapes like a lot of comic artists, he opts instead for small groups of directional lines. The only time he will actually render on lighter clothing is when it's in heavy direct shadow, and he uses the same principles for creating folds as he does for dark clothing, but with more cross-hatching. Which is a nice transition to talk about dark clothing. Joe uses his typical style, sharp angles and lots of straight lines. I feel like he draws these a bit more intricately, with the amount and the interlacing of folds in dark clothing. If I was to try and approach this method myself, I would shade the whole item, and then use an eraser to sculpt in the folds, rather than trying to do it backwards and imagine it from a blank area. What is interesting is that Joe will switch up the colour of fabric from panel to panel or scene to scene. So let's have a look. In this panel, we can see Dante kissing his mum goodbye, and to our eyes, or my eyes at least, it looks like a light coloured jacket, right? Well, let's go to the very next panel and see what happens. Now, Dante's jacket is dark all of a sudden. I think this is for two reasons. Reason number one is that in this previous panel, there is a vignette around the panel to give the ambience of nighttime. If we were to render Dante in a dark jacket in this scene, he would stick out. He would make the values of the whole panel flow really badly. The second reason is that in this panel, he wanted to make Dante stick out more against a white background, and probably against Gabriella, who is also dressed in white. Background effects. In this section, I'm going to talk about the random little background effects that Joe adds in, and how those sort of subconsciously influence us as the viewer. It's very cool. There are two main background effects that Joe adds. The first one we see is this sort of patchy hatch effect, which is used to both frame a character and give a sense of doom or shock. What's interesting is that he used this in the first issue just before Dante is about to be swallowed by the new human cloud. Almost as a precursor as drama is about to hit the proverbial fan. The second common background he uses is these blobs. I'm assuming these are there to symbolise the inhuman cloud in a more blobby and background way, as if the particles are floating in the air. Quite often, Joe will continue either the background itself or the effects into the rest of the page behind the panels. This is a really nice touch because it extends the subtext beyond that first panel, almost like it's looming in the background. Well, that's all I have for you today, folks. Thank you so much for getting to the end of the video if you're still watching. If you want to support the channel, there are links down below, and you support the channel just by watching. Until next time, keep on sketching.